What I wanted to talk about today is a new topic I've been working on about money as a content type. And the idea I want to express is that Bitcoin has introduced a fundamental transformation in how money is going to be viewed in the future by making money completely independent of the underlying transport medium and turning it into a standalone content type. What do I mean by that? A Bitcoin transaction is a signed data structure that can be executed anywhere in the world. Now, a lot of people think that a Bitcoin transaction has to be transmitted on the Bitcoin network. And that's not true. A Bitcoin transaction has to reach the miners and be included in a block. But it doesn't need to be transmitted over the Bitcoin network. There's nothing special about the Bitcoin network. It just forwards transactions and blocks. It can be transmitted over any form of communication medium. And one of the magic things about Bitcoin is that because the transaction doesn't incorporate security mechanisms itself, because the security is in the proof of work that the miners do, and the digital signature that's on the transaction is put on there by the end user with keys they store, there's nothing sensitive in a Bitcoin transaction. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. If I go to a merchant today using a point-of-sale system or a credit card, what I am transmitting to the merchant via a long series of intermediaries is the credit card number, expiry date, CCV2 code on the back of my credit card. I'm actually transmitting the secret keys. I'm transmitting the access codes to my account. Now, that information is sensitive. If that information is captured, my account can be compromised. I can be charged again and again, either by the merchant or one of the intermediaries or any hacker who's taken any of this information from any of the intermediaries. So that information needs to be very carefully protected. If you think about it, from the moment the credit card comes out of my pocket until the money is in the merchant's account, it is transported across the network in a series of virtual armored cars. There's encryption from the point of sale to the merchant's back end, from the merchant back end, encryption through to Visa for batch processing, and from Visa encryption through to the originating bank and to the destination bank, encrypting this token at every step of the way because it is the secret key. If that encryption fails at any point in the chain, the security of your credit card is compromised. That credit card is also stored at many of the points of transit. It's stored for historical purposes, which is a terrible idea because that creates a centralized treasure trove, a stash for hackers to attack. And we've seen this happen again and again. In the US, Target, Home Depot, two very, very large retailers have had incidents where they had 50 to 60 million credit cards stolen. JP Morgan Chase had 75 million accounts compromised recently. All of these things are not happening because these companies are delinquent in protecting credit cards. There are really two types of companies out there. Those that have failed to take the necessary action to secure the credit cards that you entrusted them with, and those that will soon fail to take the necessary security action to protect the credit cards you've entrusted with them. You've either been hacked or you will be hacked. Those are the two categories. Nobody is immune to this. No one can invent a way to protect millions of secure access tokens from motivated attackers. It's impossible to do. We don't know how to do it. There is no information security trick that can protect for all possible types of attacks. Credit cards are broken by design because the token itself is the secret key. And if you transmit that token, you expose your entire account to risk. Bitcoin is fundamentally different. What I'm transmitting is not the key, but simply a signed message. It is an authorization. And that authorization has two external references. One, to where the money's coming from by referencing an unspent output on the blockchain, and one reference to where I want to send the money by creating a new encumbrance, a new limitation on who can spend the money, usually a public key or Bitcoin address. And that transaction contains no sensitive data. If you steal the information in the transaction, all you know is which address the money came from and which address the money's going to and how much. That's it. The signature reveals nothing. The addresses reveal nothing. There's no identifiers. You can't modify that transaction because every part of it is included in the signature. You can't do anything other than replay it, in which case, if it didn't go through the first time, you're helping the person who signed it to propagate it more effectively into the network. You could take the transaction, you can print it out, you can post it on a billboard, you can shout it from the rooftops. A Bitcoin transaction can be transmitted over a completely unsecured Wi-Fi, by smoke signal, by light signal, with carrier pigeons. Doesn't matter. Nothing in that message can be compromised. But most people don't realize what it means to convert money into a content type. We've taken the transaction, which is just 250 bytes. We've separated from the transport medium so it doesn't depend on any underlying security. We've made it standalone so that it can be independently verified by any node that has a full copy of the blockchain. Independently verified as spendable, authentic, and properly signed by any system that has a full copy of the blockchain. In fact, even by systems that only have a partial copy of the blockchain. And that transaction can be verified in seconds. And all it has to do is reach one node in the network that can talk to miners. That's it. Once it's injected into the Bitcoin network, and once it propagates, you can be almost certain that that transaction will be included eventually and will become valid. If I look at a transaction, I can calculate if it has sufficient fees, and then I can make certain assumptions about how miners are going to treat that transaction because I know the rules by which they operate on a consensus network. And therefore, I know that once this is propagated enough, this transaction will appear in a block near you soon, right? And there's nothing magical in the transaction. So let's think about this for a second. How can you encode 250 bytes and transmit them across the network? Someone recently asked me, and I get this question a lot, can't tyrannical governments ban or block the transmission of Bitcoin transactions? And the answer is no, but I don't think people quite understand why the answer is no. So I'll give you a couple of theoretical examples to show what I mean. My first ridiculous example is the encoding of Bitcoin transactions as emoticons or smileys in Skype. Skype has a 128-character emoji alphabet, which allows you to send various frowny smiley faces, thumbs up, thumbs down, sunny days, beating hearts, birthday cakes, you know, all of those kinds of things. Now, let's look at that from an information content perspective. That's a character set, right? So if I'm a computer scientist, I look at that and I think, okay, I now have a base 128 encoding. I have 128 characters. That's a base 128 encoding. That's a really efficient encoding scheme, right? Bitcoin address is a base 58, and you can fit 256 bits in just 33 characters. A base 128 encoding would allow me to send a 250-byte transaction in just over 15 characters. 15 smileys. A Bitcoin transaction is 15 smileys. I can literally, mathematically, I can write a little script. It's 2 lines of Python probably. If you're really efficient, it's probably 1 line. No libraries needed. Where I can take the hexadecimal representation of a Bitcoin transaction, 250 bytes, and encode it in 15 of one of the 128 possible emoticons. I can then type that into a Skype window. anywhere in the world. And as long as the recipient who receives that string of 15 smileys types it into a decoder script and then simply injects it into the Bitcoin network, that transaction will go through. The recipient could be a robot. The recipient could be an automated listening station that is designed to take 15-character smileys on Skype and transmit them onto the Bitcoin network. Now, explain to me how anyone can make that stop, other than by shutting down Skype. And if they shut down Skype, I'll use Facebook. And if they shut down Facebook, I'll use Craigslist. And if they shut down Craigslist, I'll put my transaction in a TripAdvisor review. And if they shut down TripAdvisor, I'll post it as a comment in the history of a Wikipedia article. And if they shut that down, I'll post it as the background of a JPEG image in my holiday snapshots. Money is now completely disconnected information content. There is absolutely nothing you can do to stop information from traveling from anywhere in the world to anywhere in the world when you have an abundance of fully interconnected multimedia communication mechanisms as we do today. But let's say we didn't have the internet. So I came out with an even more ridiculous harebrained scheme, which is the transmission of Bitcoin transactions over shortwave frequency hopping burst radio. So this is if you want to go completely guerrilla style. In the Second World War, in occupied France, the Allies dropped thousands of shortwave radios, complete kits, with little parachutes from airplanes, so that partisans on the ground could hide these in barns, in tree hollows, in abandoned buildings, under bridges, and use them to communicate with various Allied command centers around Europe, from right under the nose of the occupying Nazi force. And one of the things about shortwave radio is that not only do you have enormous range, but you can also, in certain frequencies, bounce off the stratosphere. And at the time, they used this for voice communication or coded numbers communication, right? So Morse code and various one-time pad encryption schemes. So I'm going to make it really, really simple. Nowadays, I can go out and get a kit that allows me to connect a very simplistic shortwave radio transmitter to my laptop via USB. Now all I need is an antenna. Now the nice thing about that is that in shortwave radio, an antenna consists of a sufficiently long piece of metal, a railway line, a clothes line, a broken down electricity line, a fence line, a razor wire fence, which I notice in New Zealand you have lots of, right? It's right around those fuzzy white things that are everywhere. So now the transmission of a Bitcoin transaction involves plugging in a laptop, attaching it to a fence post, pressing enter, and transmitting a burst transaction for 25 seconds. And as long as there's a receiving station somewhere within the surrounding 1,000 miles that is connected to the Bitcoin network, and you can hide the receiving station anywhere you want. It's a passive listener. It can't be triangulated. It can inject the transaction into the network. So now if I'm a guerrilla and I want to buy something, I construct the transaction offline, and when I'm ready, run out into the middle of the field, clamp my transmitter onto a clothesline, press enter, transmit for 25 seconds, pack up my gear, and disappear into the forest. How the hell do you stop that? You don't. That's the simple answer. You don't. But that's just the beginning, because once you realize that money has become a content type, transactions have been disconnected from the medium, some really important secondary characteristics emerge. You see, the thing is, the medium is the message, as someone famous once said. And the primary reason the medium is the message is because the medium constrains, transforms, and in many cases distorts the message. When your medium is TV, your message is 18 minutes long, interrupted by advertising slots. That is your message. There is no other format you can fit there, right? So you make a message that fits that medium. And you start assigning the value of your message based on the mistaken assumption that it is equivalent to the cost of production. So TV, for example, imposes a certain cost to producing video. And people who are in that business make the mistaken assumption that the cost of producing TV is the same as the value of that show. The more you spend on it, the more valuable it is. So you can imagine their horror when something like YouTube comes along and drops the cost of production to 0. Now, what do you think is the immediate assumption that people make in that industry? If the cost is 0, then the content is worthless, right? And that is a fundamental misunderstanding of what happens when you separate the content from the message, from the medium. When you separate the message from the medium. Because what it does is it shifts your perception of value from the cost of production to the value it has to the consumer when they consume it. Let me go to an even older example. When the cost of printing is astronomical and the means of printing are available only to a select few, the only thing you print is Gutenberg Bibles. The medium defines the range of expression of the message and constrains it only to the most grandiose and important messages that society has. It limits the range of expression by imposing enormous cost of production. What do you think Gutenberg would have thought of Twitter, which takes the cost of production to 0, makes it available universally, ubiquitously, and for free? And so you go from printing the Gutenberg Bible to responding to a tweet with one of my favorite expressions, which is the 3-character opinion SMH, which means shaking my head. So when Professor Bitcoin says Bitcoin is going to 0, I can express my entire range of opinion and thoughtful analysis as 3 characters. And I have expressed my opinion to the world. Now, if you look at that from an objective perspective, surely that message is worthless. And so you make the mistaken assumption that if the cost of production is 0, and the message appears trivial on its face, then the entire combination of medium plus messages must be worthless, must be trivial, must have no value. And that's a mistake that people have made at every turn in history.